The Wild West, a time of legends, a time when a name like Dalton could either stand for justice or for the most audacious, headline-grabbing crime of the decade. They wanted to outdo Jesse James. They wanted to be history's greatest outlaws. But sometimes ambition isn't a crown, it's a bullet with your name on it. The year was 1892. The date October 5th. A sleepy, respectable town on the Kansas-Oklahoma border was about to be burned forever into the history books. Not for a new railway or a bountiful harvest, but for a massacre. The Dalton Gang. The most feared robbers in the territory had come home to die, and their tombstone would be the street outside two banks they were foolish enough to try and rob at the exact same time. This is the story of a heist that should have been the stuff of legend, but became the textbook definition of failure. A brutal 12-minute gun battle that didn't just end a gang, but decisively marked the final bloody twilight of the Wild West era. To understand how they met their spectacular end, we first have to go back, because the tragedy of the Dalton brothers isn't just about a failed robbery. It's about a family that started on the right side of the law, wore the badge of honor, and the destructive arrogance that led them to cross the line forever. The Daltons were one of 13 children raised on the rugged edge of the law in Kansas and the Oklahoma Territory. Their older brother, Frank, was a deputy U.S. Marshal, a lawman of great renown, a reputation that gave his younger brothers a privileged start. When Frank was tragically killed in 1887 while trying to arrest whiskey runners, the three younger brothers, Grat, Bob, and Emmett, saw a path to vengeance and power by picking up the badge. For a time, they walked in Frank's shadow, or at least tried to. Grat and Bob were deputized as U.S. Marshals in the sprawling, lawless Oklahoma Territory. They were the law riding hard, hunting outlaws, and carrying the authority of the federal government, often alongside legendary figures like Heck Thomas. They knew the terrain and the trade of the outlaw better than anyone, but there was something insidious working beneath the surface of frontier justice. The law was an arduous path, the pay was infrequent, the work was dangerous, and the temptation of easy money, taken from outlaws or trains, was a constant, gnawing presence. Bob Dalton was the spark, younger than Grat, yet the most reckless and, crucially, the most ambitious. He once famously declared, "I will whip anything in this country." That ambition was coupled with a volatile temper and a deep-seated contempt for legitimate work. Slowly, the line blurred. Historical records show that Grat was discharged from his martial duties for being drunk and conducting himself badly. Bob and Emmett were soon facing rumors of horse stealing and illegally selling whiskey to the Osage Nation. They were essentially operating as outlaws while wearing the government badge. Bob even leveraged his position to shoot a romantic rival, a man named Deputy Ed Stokely, in what was officially labeled a suspicious arrest, confirming his capacity for brutal self-interest and misuse of power. The badge, it seemed, was less about morality and more about opportunity. They weren't just stepping into crime, they were plunging headfirst, dragging their family name with them. The seeds of their destruction were planted in the very soil of the law they swore to uphold. The official descent began around 1890. Disgraced and with warrants looming, the three brothers, Bob, Grat, and Emmett, abandoned the badge for the life of a career outlaw. They fled west, joining up with more established criminals. But it was Bob's sheer desire for infamy and his reckless ambition that propelled their first major strike. Bob wanted glory as much as gold. The first major strike that put the Dalton name on the front page of every newspaper in the West was in California. In February 1891, they robbed a Southern Pacific freight train at Alila. The robbery itself was a pathetic failure. The loot was small, but in the ensuing chaotic gunfight, a fireman was killed. Grat was captured and sent to trial, facing a possible death sentence in California. But the Daltons did not fail to escape. Grat, ever the lucky one, managed to slip away from his guards before sentencing, riding a locomotive tender to freedom in a dramatic escape that only solidified their reputation as slippery, dangerous criminals. The brothers rendezvoused back in the Oklahoma Territory. Now, they weren't just thieves, they were indicted murderers and wanted men across state lines, with a high price on their heads. They had escalated beyond simple robbery into serious federal crimes, and there was no turning back. Back in the territory, the brothers solidified their new enterprise. They recruited reliable, hardened outlaws. There was Bill Powers, a Texas cowboy who had drifted into crime after an argument over a game of poker and a desire for easy fortune, and Dick Broadwell, a former saloon keeper who had fallen into bad company. Drawn to Bob's charisma and confidence, the Dalton Gang was born, and its reputation began to snowball. They were a five-man wrecking crew, well-armed, well-mounted, and increasingly confident. They became synonymous with train robbery throughout the entire Oklahoma Territory. The next 18 months were a reign of terror, a blur of successful, terrifying heists focused almost entirely on trains. May 1891, the Santa Fe train at Wharton, Oklahoma. They netted thousands. September 1891, the Katy train at Leliata, Oklahoma. They refined their technique, forced the engineer to stop, proceed quickly to the express car, often used dynamite to blow the safe doors, and vanish into the vast, protective badlands of the territory before any posse could be assembled. They were the undisputed, untouchable kings of the Oklahoma Territory, known for their daring and speed. But while they were feared, they were also careless. They often wasted the money in drunken sprees and gambling dens, leaving them perpetually chasing the next big score. And with every successful raid, Bob Dalton's overconfidence, his central and deepest flaw, grew into something monstrous. He was convinced they were truly the best, destined for a level of fame that transcended ordinary criminality. He craved the headlines and the historical comparison to the great outlaws of the previous generation. The relentless pursuit of the law, primarily Deputy U.S. Marshal Heck Thomas and his deputies, was closing in. The territory was getting too hot, the escape routes too well patrolled, the posses too quick. Bob knew they needed one final massive score, a prize that would allow them to retire to South America or Mexico and disappear forever. He needed a score that would make their infamous cousins, the James and younger boys, look like amateurs. He planned to permanently write the name Dalton into history as the most successful, most daring outlaws of the age. Bob's ultimate, arrogant goal was to prove the Daltons were the greatest outlaws of all time, and to achieve that, he formulated a plan of unparalleled, stunning audacity. Robbed two banks at the same time, in broad daylight, a feat never before attempted in the annals of Western crime. And where better to make history than in the town that knew them best? Their old stomping grounds, Coffeyville, Kansas. The choice of Coffeyville was calculated, yet tragically flawed. It was their hometown, or near enough to it. They had family and childhood acquaintances here. They knew the streets, yes, but the people knew their faces. Bob, however, saw it as a place where they could operate with minimal resistance. A town that would be so shocked by the sheer size of the scheme that they would surrender without a fight. Coffeyville was a prosperous, burgeoning community, an important trading post just north of the Indian Territory border. It had two well-stocked banks, the First National Bank and the Condon Bank. They were strategically situated just across a narrow alley from each other on the main plaza, the perfect proximity for a simultaneous strike. The target was perfect. The plan horribly, tragically wrong. The gang, Bob, Grat Emmett, Bill Powers, and Dick Broadwell, rode north for 2 tense quiet days toward their destiny. They had meticulously planned the route, the timing, and the division of labor. They knew the risk was immense. They believed, however, they were simply too fast, too smart, and too feared to be stopped. They were about to learn that courage is not unique to outlaws. It lives in the hearts of shopkeepers, barbers, and stable owners. The morning of October 5th, 1892, broke crisp and clear over Coffeyville. The air was cool, the streets were busy with early commerce. The kind of day where the only thing anyone expected to hear was the clatter of a wagon or the ring of the blacksmith's hammer. The town was alive, but blissfully unaware of the 5 horsemen closing in on them, riding slowly and deliberately through the quiet outskirts. The 5 outlaws rode into town from the south. Bob had tried to plan for everything. They approached via a winding, deserted route known as Robber's Alley. They all wore new clothes, and 2 of the brothers, including Grat, donned cheap, theatrical disguises, false beards and moustaches, to fool their former neighbors. They had planned to shed these immediately after the heist, once they were clear of the town. But they hit their first roadblock before they even drew a gun, a small detail that became the first massive fissure in their plan, throwing their meticulous timing off. The hitching rail on the main street, where they had planned to tie their horses for a clean, visible and swift getaway, had been torn up due to street repairs. This forced them to turn down a narrow passage running between the 2 banks. They tied their horses, their only guaranteed path to freedom, to a fence deep in this dusty passage, a place that would forever be known as Death Alley. The extra distance and cover would prove fatal. Time check, it was approximately 9:40 a.m. The banks had been open for less than an hour. They dismounted and split their force. Bob and Emmett Dalton would take the First National Bank. Grat Dalton, Bill Powers, and Dick Broadwell would take the Condon Bank. The clock was ticking. They walked quickly and confidently out of the alley and onto the town square. This is the instant Bob's arrogant plan disintegrated. As the 5 men walked from the alley to the bank entrances, a Coffeyville citizen was riding a horse-drawn buggy past. His name was R.H. Wilson, and he was on his way to his office. Wilson was a former neighbor, and despite the fake, ill-fitting beards and new clothes, his eyes locked on one of the figures. Wilson didn't see a nameless bandit. He saw Grat Dalton. The recognition was immediate, unmistakable. Some accounts say it was the swagger, the familiarity of his gait, or the intense, focused eyes that gave him away beneath the disguise. The identity didn't matter. Wilson knew one thing: the Dalton boys were back in town, and they were heading for the banks. Wilson raced his buggy away, not yelling a panic-inducing alarm, which would have simply triggered chaos, but passing the word quietly and urgently to the key people he trusted: the store owners, the stable owners, the town marshal. The news spread like a shockwave, a chain reaction of whispered terror and disciplined mobilization. "The Daltons are robbing the banks! Get your guns!" Coffeyville was a frontier town, and its citizens were armed, often with shotguns and Winchester rifles kept ready in their shops for hunting or protection. The local hardware store, Isham's Hardware, became the spontaneous arsenal, where men grabbed rifles and ammunition, distributing them quickly. Within minutes, not hours but minutes, a core group of armed, determined citizens had converged on the town square. Marshal C. T. Connolly quickly organized the initial disciplined defense, sending men to positions commanding the alley and the bank entrances. The element of surprise, the core of the Daltons' planting, was utterly gone. Now the gang was trapped in a town full of people who not only hated outlaws, but knew exactly who the outlaws were. They were walking into a cleverly laid ambush, surrounded by men fighting not for gold but for their community. Unaware of the growing ring of steel outside, the Heists proceeded inside the banks. Grat Dalton, Bill Powers, and Dick Broadwell entered the Condon Bank, which held a reputation for large cash reserves. Grat demanded access to the main vault. The paying teller, C.M. Condon, a quick-witted and brave man, did not panic. He looked Grat Dalton in the eye and employed a masterful stalling tactic. He calmly claimed the main vault was on a time lock and could not be opened for at least 10 more minutes. The historical record confirms the brilliance of this lie. There was no time lock. It was a brilliant, life-saving deception that worked because Grat Dalton was already jittery. Grat, already nervous about the exposed location and wanting to avoid the noise and attention of blasting the safe, actually said, "I'll wait." That single phrase, "I'll wait," gave the townspeople the crucial time they needed to finish their organization, load their weapons, and take up their final, deadly positions. Grat ordered his men to instead scoop up all the loose cash from the cages, a meager the 1,500, that would ultimately be the only money they even momentarily touched. Across the alley, Bob and Emmett Dalton were less fortunate but far more greedy. They burst into the First National Bank. They quickly secured the cashier Thomas Ayers and teller W.H. Levan, forcing them to empty the till and the safe deposit boxes. Bob was methodical, driven by the desire for a massive final haul. He secured a massive 20,000 and stuffed it all into a large grain sack. He was taking his time, confident, blind to the fact that every second he spent counting money was a second a citizen outside was loading a shotgun and taking aim. His greed was his second, and ultimately final, fatal error. The silence of the town square shattered. Time check approximately 9:45 a.m. The initial group of armed citizens, men like Marshal C.T. Connolly, hardware dealer Lucius Baldwin, shoemaker Charles Brown, and livery stable owner John J. Clower, had been waiting patiently, their Winchesters and shotguns loaded. They had formed a deadly, silent ring around the two banks, sealing the Daltons' fate. The first action took place outside the Condon Bank, directly confirming the worst fears of the town. Grat Dalton's 10-minute wait was up. He and his two accomplices, Powers and Broadwell, prepared to exit, deciding to cut their losses with the meager 1,500 in cash and make a run for the horses. As they prepared to step out, the firing started. Marshal Connolly, positioned across the street, fired his rifle, not only to strike but to signal the opening of the ambush. The bullet crashed through the thick plate glass window of the Condon Bank and struck Dick Broadwell sharply in the arm. The noise, the sudden shower of glass, the sight of blood. It was the signal for all-out war, sending the town into a furious, disciplined, defensive action. Grat, Powers, and Broadwell fired wildly back at the muzzle flashes they saw outside, then scrambled out of the bank. Their goal, Death Alley and their tied horses. They had to cross a short, exposed expanse of open street to reach the alley entrance, running for their lives. But the alley was now a meticulously planned, fatal gauntlet. Waiting at the entrance to the alley, with a clear and devastating line of sight, was John J. Clower, the livery stable owner. Clower was a dead shot with a Winchester rifle, and he was the central pillar of the citizens' defense. He opened fire on the fleeing outlaws. His first bullet found its mark on Bill Powers, who was running slightly ahead of the group, rushing toward the escape route. Powers staggered violently and fell dead almost instantly, his body sprawling at the very entrance to the alley, blocking the passage, his escape route sealed shut. The sight was horrific, but the citizens held their nerve. Grat Dalton, seeing his escape blocked and his comrade fall, became a momentary target for the concentrated fire of several citizens. Clower and others, including citizen George Cubine, returned fire with devastating accuracy. The shooting was furious and relentless. Grat was struck multiple times, dropping lifelessly near the mouth of the alley, joining his accomplice. The 1,500 he had clutched in a bag scattered into the dusty street, a worthless pile of paper money. Dick Broadwell, wounded but still running, managed to stumble a short distance down the street before collapsing and bleeding out, dying shortly thereafter. In under 3 minutes, the Dalton Gang, 3 outlaws, were annihilated, their bodies littering the street that ran toward the promised sanctuary of their horses. Across the alley, Bob and Emmett Dalton were finally ready to emerge from the First National Bank with their massive sack of cash. They stepped out of the front door, oblivious to the extent of the carnage, expecting a clear run. The noise of the first exchange was deafening, and as they took their first steps onto the sidewalk, they walked directly into a blizzard of lead. The townspeople, alerted by the deafening volley from the Condon side, concentrated their fire. Bob and Emmett were forced back inside the bank, the sack of cash scattering on the floor. The heavy grain sack useless now, the rich loot abandoned. The glass windows shattered inward, adding to the deafening chaos. Bob, the ruthless leader, tried a desperate, final tactic. He ordered the bank employees Thomas Ayers and W.H. Levin to walk out in front of them as human shields, hoping the citizens would hold their fire. But the torrent of fire from the citizens was too relentless, too personal, and too furious for any delay. The employees, seizing the opportunity amid the confusion, ducked and broke free, running clear of the bank. The two Daltons were forced to try and flee out the back door, desperate for the relative cover of the alley, where their horses were tied. As Bob and Emmett burst out the rear of the building into the alley, they ran directly into the most dedicated and strategically placed defenders, Town Marshal C.T. Connolly and shoemaker Charles Brown. A brutal, close-quarters exchange erupted in the narrow alleyway, the sounds echoing between the high brick buildings. The town paid its tragic price in this critical moment. Charles Brown was instantly killed by the outlaws' desperate gunfire. Marshal Connolly was shot and critically wounded. He would die later that day. The outlaws had taken 2 lives, but the 2 brothers were also severely wounded, though still firing. In a separate exchange, hardware dealer Lucius M. Baldwin was also shot and killed, cementing the terrible cost of the town's resistance. Bob Dalton, riddled with bullets and desperate, dragged himself toward the alley fence where his horse was tied. He saw his brother Grat's lifeless body, a final, gut-wrenching confirmation that their master plan had become a complete, bloody disaster. He realized then that they were cornered, and the town was not going to surrender. John Clowyer and George Kubiting, another brave citizen who unfortunately would also be killed in the fight, focused their fire on the leader Bob. Accounts describe Bob stumbling, falling, and trying to raise his rifle one last time. Bob was struck again and again, collapsing right next to the horse he had hoped would carry him to freedom. He died there. The arrogant leader finally silenced, his dreams of outdoing Jesse James dying in the dust of his former hometown. The man who craved infamy achieved it, but not on his own terms. The youngest of the brothers, Emmett, was now alone, shot perhaps 24 times, but still clinging to life. A miraculous display of pure, stubborn survival. Despite his severe wounds, he managed to stagger to his horse, and in a final heartbreaking act of loyalty, he rode over to his fallen brother Bob. Emmett reached down, trying to help Bob onto his horse for a desperate, final escape, but Bob, the man who had dragged his brothers into infamy with his limitless ambition, only had a single raspy, dying whisper left: "It's no use." That tender, tragic moment was punctuated by a shotgun blast from a citizen, identified as town barber Carey Seaman, striking Emmett and sending him tumbling from his saddle. He landed in the dirt, grievously wounded, but miraculously still alive, the only outlaw left standing, or rather lying. The air was thick with smoke, the street littered with spent brass and blood, and the silence that followed was deafening. The 12-minute gun battle that destroyed the Dalton Gang was over. The citizens cautiously emerged from their cover, surveying the carnage. The sun was high over Coffeyville. The Dalton Gang was no more. Bob Dalton, Grat Dalton, Bill Powers, and Dick Broadwell, 4 of the 5 outlaws, were dead. Their bodies were collected and laid out in a grim tableau on a wagon for a now famous photograph. A visceral symbol of frontier justice, that was instantly reprinted in newspapers across the country, showing the world that the age of the glamorous outlaw was brutally over. And defeated decisively by ordinary citizens, the photo served as a stark warning to any who dared to follow in their footsteps. But the town's victory was stained with blood. Coffeyville had paid a devastating price. The Daltons took 4 brave citizens with them: Town Marshal C.T. Connolly, Deputy Marshal Frank Wells, shoemaker Charles Brown, and hardware dealer Lucius M. Baldwin. The funerals for these 4 heroes were massive, somber events, affirming the town's unity and courage in the face of tragedy. Coffeyville was instantly hailed nationally as the town that killed the Dalton Gang, becoming a permanent fixture in Western history as a place where outlaws met their match. The final irony of Bob Dalton's grand scheme was revealed in the accounting. The total amount stolen was recovered almost immediately, abandoned on the floor of the First National Bank. After the day's business was completed and the books balanced, the Condon Bank was found to be only $20 short from the cashier's drawer. The First National Bank, they were hilariously $1.98 over for the day, due to the confusing scramble. The Daltons had risked their lives and the lives of a town for almost nothing. They had died not as wealthy legends, but as tragic, spectacular failures. The 5th member, Emmett Dalton, was a medical miracle. Despite being hit by at least 23 bullets, wounds to the arms, chest, and groin, none had struck a major artery or organ. He survived, a living testament to the ferocity of the battle and his own uncanny luck. Emmett was eventually put on trial in Independence, Kansas. Public fury was immense, but the trial was remarkably fair. Recognizing the futility of an appeal, he pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. He was convicted and sentenced to life in the Kansas State Penitentiary in Lansing. The youngest of the brothers, he was the only one left to carry the notorious family name, a walking, breathing reminder of the failure in Coffeyville. This is where the story takes its final, strangest turn, completing the historical arc of the family name. Prison was brutal, but transforming. Emmett Dalton was a model prisoner. He studied, he worked, and he demonstrated genuine reform, becoming a highly trusted and compliant inmate. He became a devout Christian and committed to turning his life around, expressing deep remorse for the lives lost. After a decade of tireless advocacy from his family, and recognizing the extraordinary circumstances of the case, Governor George H. Hodges granted Emmett Dalton parole in 1907. Emmett, the last surviving Dalton, did not return to crime. He moved to California, married his childhood sweetheart Julia Lewis, and began a new, quiet life. He eventually leveraged his unique infamy into a new career in the budding movie industry, becoming a screenwriter and actor. He wrote a book, When the Daltons Rode, which became a major motion picture, and he even consulted on other Western films, essentially transforming his outlaw past into a lucrative Hollywood legend. The man who had faced the firing squad of a furious town found peace. He died a respectable, comfortable man in his own bed in Los Angeles in 1937, at the age of 66. The youngest and least enthusiastic of the robbers was the only one to find freedom, having lived a total of 14 years behind bars and 45 years as a free man after the raid. His life became a symbol of redemption and the final, quiet echo of the great outlaw era, demonstrating that some found a way out of the bloody history of the Wild West. The Coffeyville raid of 1892 was more than just a failed robbery, it was a watershed moment. It didn't just end the Dalton Gang, it decisively signaled the dramatic, spectacular twilight of the classic, reckless Wild West outlaw, proving that organized citizen resistance could defeat even the most fearsome gang. The sheer audacity of Bob Dalton's plan, robbing 2 banks simultaneously to outdo Jesse James, was undone by a familiar face, a handful of quick-witted men, and a brave town's collective will to fight back. They sought to become legends of infamy, but they only succeeded in creating legends of heroism. The story of Coffeyville remains a testament to the idea that no plan, no matter how bold, can survive contact with the collective courage of ordinary people who refuse to be victims. What do you think was Bob Dalton's biggest mistake? Wearing a bad disguise or tying his horses in Death Alley? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want to see another story about an outlaw's final stand, click on the video on your screen right now. Thanks for watching.